Sorry. So we will be hearing from Gerald Faulhaber, Professor Emeritus of Business Economics and Public Policy at the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you all for coming. When my friend Dave Farber said that he was coming to Keio University to co-chair a research on cyber civilization, I thought, boy, that sounds really grand. You know, civilization, we economists, we just think about, demand and supply and maybe strategic interactions, but civilization, boy, that's pretty big. So I wasn't sure what to do about that, but I gave some thought, okay? And I thought, well, that's something worth thinking about. And, what are the issues here? And where does civilization come from? And where does cyber fit in and so forth? So I'm going to be sharing my initial thoughts about this with you. Also keep in mind I am an economist, so you'll be seeing that in here. So, okay, we use the word civilization. It's like, well, what the heck are we talking about? Well, let's go back. Homo sapiens has been on this planet some 200,000 years. Most of this uncivilized, as we might call it. And civilization is much more recent and dates fairly recently in the grand scheme of things. So this is, in a sense, new, okay? Now, what did we do in that period in between? Well, before we had things like civilization, we did have human organizations. They tended to be clans, family organizations of hunter-gatherers, nomadic herders, so forth. Nothing we would call civilization. The first wave of civilization coincided with the adoption of agriculture first in Mesopotamia, the Babylon of the title, okay? What was it? An organization of super-family groups to ensure stability, encouragement, and security of economy and society. Now, what's new here is economy and society, okay? And what we have to have is we have to have a way of securing that. And that's how civilization came about. And it was much bigger than families and clans. And in fact was determined by what the economy looked like. Now, when we say scarce resource, economic driver, what do I mean by that? Well, economics has always been driven by the control of a scarce resource. Scarce resource is, what is it we really need to make this economy work? We really need it, okay? Well, in agriculture, that's pretty simple. It's land. Now, this is much less important if you're wandering around with your herds of yaks in Central Asia, or looking for berries someplace. Now, all of a sudden, we have land, and land is important. People own it, they cultivate it, they grow wheat, later corn, so forth. And their property has to be protected. First of all, you have to have property, and then it has to be protected, which means you have to define and enforce property rights. This doesn't have to be private property, but it does have to be property, and there has to be rights to the access of it. And you have to secure this property from competitors who might be your neighbors, okay, and outside forces, which might be from nature or from other civilizations. So security becomes an issue here, okay, as a function of why do we need civilizations. Civilization didn't just come about, it was driven by the adoption of agriculture. Now, here's one thing we know, and this has not changed. Such civilizations are dominated by those who control the scarce resource. Simple, okay? It could be landowners, it could be the government officials, what have you. Now, as agriculture spread, so did the first wave of civilization. East Asia, for example, South Asia, Egypt, eventually Europe, and eventually the Americas. Okay? And it followed agriculture. That's what it was, because civilization was necessary for agriculture based on land. Okay? Now, these are wildly different civilizations. Chinese civilization, wildly different than Egyptians, wildly different than Europeans, what have you. But they're all based on the same scarce resource, land. Okay? Now, what came before? They were hunter-gatherers, nomadic herders, organized by family and tribes. They were defenders of lifestyle, soldiers, hunters, hunt-gatherers, and maintainers. That's what it was like. We didn't see any farming. People didn't know about farming. It's like, who knows about farming? We'll go out and pick it from the trees. Very few craftspeople. Some, but very rare. Okay. The differences, and I say these are wild differences across civilizations. In Babylon, we had managing property rights in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. And that's what Hammurabi and the leaders of Babylonia were. In Egypt, the pharaoh ruled all. Nile flooding leads to very big problems about property rights. How do you control property rights, and what are the rights that you have to navigation, and who builds it? Okay? In China, the emperor's mandarins were in control. In Japan, and this of course is later, very decentralized shogunates were in control. In Britain, and this is one I know a little bit more about, we have land-based aristocracy. If you own land, you were a baron or a count or earl or whatever, and you ran stuff. You were well-to-do. You controlled the resources, and people worked for you. And this was the power base in Great Britain. Now, in the U.S., land was distributed somewhat more equally, but this is certainly not true of the South, where there was a great concentration of land. Okay? But all first wave civilizations were based on control, encouragement, and security of land. And that's what you had to do. You had to make sure it was safe to farm, and you were going to be economically better off farming. Now, who are the winners in all this? The socio-political structures, despite these wild differences, were actually fairly similar. Very steeply hierarchical. Okay? It's not, in Egypt, it was the pharaoh first, but it was still pretty hierarchical. Wealth and power were determined by land ownership. The emperor and king, landowning nobles, fighting men, craftspeople, serfs. Okay? Income inequality in these civilizations was extreme. Okay? They evolved, but they evolved slowly. We think in the West, particularly Great Britain, the Magna Carta, and later the Glorious Revolution, began to change how these civilizations developed. But it was slow. It took a long time. The American and French revolutions speeded things up a little bit. The Meiji Restoration, a big change in Japan. Evolution as to how these things evolved. Now, how long did this first wave last? The earliest indications of change date from the end of the 19th century in England. However, we have many less developed countries. They're still very much land-based agrarian civilizations. It hasn't gone away, okay? But now we say less developed countries, these tend to be agrarian civilizations. Many advanced societies still maintain the social structures from the earlier agricultural civilizations. If you think about English, it still has an English land-based aristocracy. Now, they're not the really rich people in England, but it's still an important part of the social structure. Okay? But land as a scarce resource has been steadily losing ground. Now, this doesn't mean it's unnecessary. It's certainly necessary. It's the scarcity that's the issue. Is it scarce? Okay? Parts of the world it still is. Most developed countries, it's not. Okay, agricultural land is not that expensive. We're buying it up and building shopping malls on it. Okay, so now there's a second way. What was it? The development in manufacturing and the invention of powerful mechanical devices led to a new scarce resource, and this is capital. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about capitalism. I'm talking about capital as a scarce resource in economic development. This could be in a capitalist society, could be in a communist or socialist society. You still had capital, and capital is a scarce resource. Okay, so this is not a political statement here. Okay? This is what you had to have. We see this begin at the very end of the 18th century in England. Probably, in my view, the most explicit evidence of this occurred in the United States after the Civil War. Okay, it was a tremendous period of growth for capital. We saw it begin, and it was created by manufacturing and the capital required to support it. English armaments and railroads, probably the first example. Okay, very capital intensive. The American telegraph, going back to the 1840s, but it really begins to take off after the Civil War, where we began, at least in the United States, throwing railroads down every place we could, retail manufacturers, oil, chemical, and eventually autos. All this grew at the end of the 19th, early part of the 20th century. And the United States was a leader in this, but other countries were following very quickly. This also occurred after the Meiji Restoration in Japan as well, where there was, in a sense, a bigger change. Okay? The size of the U.S. market was critical here. It's a huge market, okay? And it led to the creation of the world's largest firms, Carnegie, U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, Ford, General Motors, etc. Monster firms by the standards of the world. And all capital intensive. This is what underlay all this, was capital, okay? And it was something that the U.S. had a lot of, and if it didn't have enough, the Europeans were quite willing to send their capital over here to help us build, okay? Here being the U.S., okay? This happened in a fairly short period of time. If you think about this, Henry Ford was building his River Rouge plant around 1915 or so, which was a prime example of the use of capital for mass production of the Model T Ford, a gigantic capital-intensive industry. What are the consequences of the Second World War, of the Second Wave? The funds from Europe poured into U.S. firms, just poured, okay, and increased the size and power in the 20th century to dominate the world. Just huge. But income inequality increased enormously, creating a labor movement in response, in political response, to this great concentration of wealth at the top, and we see it as represented in labor laws and a labor movement, okay? And this occurred in the United States, where in many cases the labor movement was violent. People were killed. We saw this happen. AFL-CIO, of course, is the American unions. J-Tuck Ringo is what occurred in Japan at roughly the same time. Ultimately, a series of compromises by the mid-20th century, political compromises resulted in both labor and capital sharing the growth, and income inequality was reduced from what it was, say, in 1900. Okay? But that was a political solution to the problems that came about from the second wave. It was still the case that capital was the dominant driver of economics in the developed world. In some sense, developed world means capital-based. What happened to land? Well, we still use it, okay? It's just the technology has enabled the creation of goods and services being capital, which has also enabled a vast reduction of resources required for agriculture. I always find this amazing. In 1870, 60% of U.S. families were engaged in farming. Okay, and even that was not the largest in the world. I mean, there's other countries that had more. In 1918, that number is 1%. 1% of U.S. households make their living farming. And actually, they produce a lot more food than we did back in 1870. Very interesting. Definition of productivity increase. 45% of total land is used by farming. I think the rest of it's shopping malls, I'm not sure. It's still important. You need land. That's what you have to grow stuff on. But it's no longer the scarce resource, no longer the economic driver. Okay. Which is interesting now because all the countries we have are organized by land, aren't they? That's what defines a country, is the land. So this whole stuff sticks around. What's happened to capital? In 1870 up to 1970, the U.S. was investing the preponderance of world capital. In some sense, it had the infrastructure to take advantage of that. And the size of the market did it. No longer even close, okay? Capital is invested around the world, including East Asia, South Asia, Europe, because it's now widely available and cheap. It's no longer a scarce resource. Capital's easy to get. Just go to the venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, okay? Still needed for manufacturing and services, but just to give you an idea, manufacturing is a much smaller part of the U.S. economy. It's 12% of U.S. GDP, okay? And incidentally, the number of people who are working in manufacturing, a fraction of them is much less than this, okay? And just to give you a point, the U.S. is the second strongest manufacturing country in the world in terms of value add, not in terms of people manufacturing, employed manufacturing. Now, what's the next big thing? Well, the economy is now consumption driven. It's not production driven. Production is easy. It's not agriculture driven. Farming is even easier. But it's driven by consumption. It's also driven by technology. And it's always been driven by technology, but this is much more intensively driven. And both depend, this is key, on information. That's what this is about. It's information. Who wants to buy what? When? How? What's the value they're putting on things? All information. How are the demographics changing? Information. Who are my friends? How do I reach them? Who knows who my friends are? Information. What products and services can be made available? When? How? At what cost? And what does the government need to provide? All these key aspects are information. Manufacturing titans are less important. General Motors, ThyssenKrupp, Boeing, not that important anymore. The controllers of information are the new corporate giants. This is perhaps a little aggressive, but go with me here. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. These are the biggies, okay? Not quite so true. Amazon's not quite so big as we think it is, but it's big. I will say, just as a assignment, oil is going to continue to be really important, at least for a while. But the manufacturing industries are becoming less and less important. Okay. We are now entering the third wave of civilization, the information age, or cyber civilization. The scarce resource is information and our ability to use it. Okay. Value will be added by information. not the firms that use it. Ultimately, it's going to be Android and Google, not Samsung. What are the consequences of the third wave? The new firms are increasingly dominant. Now, let me make this clear. I'm not saying they're bad. Okay? We're not making a statement about that. We're just saying, Google has what, 85% of advertising in the US? They're big. Okay? And we need to think about that. Doesn't mean it's bad, but we need to think about it. Amazon is going up relative to Walmart, but let me tell you, Walmart is still a lot bigger. But Amazon is growing faster. Google versus GE, no question mark there. Okay. It has also translated into great individual wealth. Okay. Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, Bill Gates at Microsoft, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, so forth and so on. What are the names from 100 years ago? Carnegie, JP Morgan. Okay, the same thing is happening. Great concentrations of wealth of those who are the pioneers in this area. When you have a change in civilization, when you change the scarce resource, people who are in charge of that will do extremely well. And this is what's happening. Not these guys are bad guys. They're bringing us new stuff. But they're making a ton of money out of it, okay? We've also seen some income stagnation for middle and working class. And income inequality is strongly increasing. In 1950 to 1980, the top 0.1% in the income bracket took about 3 to 4% of the total income. Today, that's 10%. So that's more than doubled, almost tripled. The bottom 50% took 20% of total income in 1979. They're now down to 13%. These are pretty strong moves towards income inequality. Exactly what we saw in the beginning of the 20th century. So the change going from capital civilization to cyber civilization, we see the same things reflected and have the same problems. Now, what are we going to do about this? In some sense, this is what the Center for Research on Civilization is about, cyber civilization. But, for example, what happened with big firms at the start of the second wave? Well, we had antitrust. Antitrust was our way of dealing with the Standard Oils and the Carnegies and the US Steel, what have you. Okay? And it worked pretty well. We had a way to do this. And a lot of people are saying, well, we have dominance. Let's apply antitrust. Well, it turns out antitrust for the manufacturing wave, the capital wave, was based on monopoly pricing, less innovation, and unhappy customers. Okay, so everybody was cheering antitrust. Okay, they thought this was good. Customers are going to be better off. This is fine. Well, we have called for antitrust today, but it's really not the right tool. First of all, prices are low or zero. We don't see what's happened back with US Steel and JP Morgan and what have you. Innovation is pretty high. Okay, some of this is from new firms. Some of it is from existing firms that are big. Some of it is existing firms buying up innovative new firms and continuing to innovate. But it's hard to find people who are not happy. Okay? My wife and I are big on Amazon Prime, and I think many people in this room are big on Amazon Prime too. We like it. Its prices are low and it delivers goods in 2 days, maybe 1 day. And it's like, yes, that's what I need. I need something like this. And the prices are not high. So what are the problems? If the problem in the second wave was monopoly pricing, well, that doesn't seem to be happening here at all. What are the problems? And if we have problems, what are the tools we need to fix it? Because it's pretty clear that antitrust is not the way to go. Okay? Now, here's a couple of suggestions. These are not new to me, but one of the issues is privacy, which is to say, okay, Google isn't charging you to use your service, but they're taking your personal data and selling it. Okay? Well, it's a privacy issue. This could be a policy issue we want to think about. Should we permit this to happen? If not, how do we control it? Is it important to people? If you give up your privacy to get Google, is that a good deal for you? If not, how do we change the way the market works for this? A little unclear. The second item, and I'm not sure how to deal with this, but large firms could have outsized political influence. And I think that's pretty clear. It certainly happens with oil companies, large banks. So why wouldn't this be true of Microsoft? Okay. And if so, how do we control that? Here the problem is the distribution of political power. Okay. What do we do about inequality? Now, the second wave solution, incidentally, I hope it's clear. I'm not giving you the answer to these things. The best I can do is state the problem fairly clearly, and that's what I'm trying to do. The second wave solution was labor law and unions. Is that going to work here? I don't think so. People talk about this in terms of Uber and Lyft and things like that, but I don't know where that's going to go. What's the third wave solution? Well, one thing, and this is a good thing for universities to understand, education. People talk in the United States with great enthusiasm about bringing manufacturing back to the United States. After it left the United States, first of all in the 70s to come here, then to China and Southeast Asia. Well, it's going to come back to the factory floor, okay? What we don't seem to realize is what the factory floor is going to look like. If we go back to Henry Ford and the River Rouge plant where he had, I don't know, like 1,000 people working on a mile-long assembly line, it's not going to look like that. It's going to be much shorter. Most of the things working on the factory floor will be robots. There will be very few people working with the robots. There will be very few people in a room upstairs working on computers that are controlling the robots. That's what manufacturing looks like, and it will not just be in the United States. That's what manufacturing is beginning to look like in China. Okay, so this is going to continue. Okay, and this raises the issue: how does AI impact employment? Well, it may substitute for certain workers, but it also might require workers to have different skills. Okay, the people up in the room controlling the robots might have a community college education to teach them how to run computers, but they need to do that. They can't simply stop at high school or below. They've got to have education. Workforce education is going to be a necessity, and one thing, we've talked about this before, but it's got to happen. This has to be a lifelong commitment to education. Universities and educators are going to have to adapt to that. I've seen this happen. We live in a rural community in southern Delaware in the United States, which still has a lot of craftsmen, farmers, people that work with their hands. They are used to thinking of the local community college, Del Tech, as somewhere they go back every couple of years to increase their skills. That's got to become, people have to have access to that, and they have to understand to take advantage of it. Okay, they don't now. Okay. Labor law for the gig economy. How does Uber treat its workers? How do we control Uber? We don't know this. I mean, these are new, many of us academics have worked as consultants to industries. And we're used to not getting medical expenses paid, okay? But if it's Uber drivers, do we want to change that as opposed to academic consultants? I don't know. We've got to think that one through. Ooh, taxation and redistribution. Okay, I mean, that's always a brute force way to deal with inequalities. Not the best way, but still it could be possible, and we need to think about that as well. Okay, let me conclude all this. Enormous opportunities are coming, and I think we know that. Okay, this will change the way we live in very substantial ways. But there's also enormous social, economic, and political problems. The distribution of the benefits of this could be wildly different across the population. There's no question about that, which gives a rise from the income inequality problem to are there going to be enough jobs to support people, okay? And political problems. How is that going to play out? Now, let me be clear. We are not ready to address these problems. We are not even close. Okay? We're not, I mean, we're thinking about what are the problems, and we haven't even sorted that out yet. Okay? People still think, for example, antitrust is going to work. Like, what? Think that one through. But, you know, we're still at a very early stage of thinking this through, which I think is a reason to have this Center for Research in Cyber Civilization. Is to kind of say, can we map a way forward here? What are the kinds of things that we might plausibly anticipate? And I would say that's something that we should be looking at, okay, with your center. Second wave solutions are generally not going to work. We are wasting time and effort trying to make them fit. Okay, they're there, we think they can work, they won't. Okay, and antitrust is a good example, it's something I know the most about. Are our political systems up to the challenge? Well, I'm going to let you decide that. Okay. I'll have nothing to say for that coming from the United States. Okay? Thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions. Do you want to do questions, or do we want to? This would be question time. Raise your hand, you know, this kind of thing.
Yes, Jonathan, go ahead.
Just
Do we have a mic on the floor? Can we bring it?
Just one very quick question. I, of course, agree with almost everything you've said.
Oh my God.
Except towards the end, but we'll get to that in the panel, I guess. One thing is to do with the notion of scarcity and scarcity of resources. Two small comments. From the British perspective, after the plague, labor was the scarce resource. Mm-hmm. And the scarcity of labor post-feudal times created an enormous amount of change, economic change and so on, even to the level of the property rights, the strip farms that were collectively owned by people, mm-hmm. and in particular the notion of a commons. And one of the big political changes was the emergence of the diggers and the levelers. So the common land was land that was owned by everybody, and everyone had access to it. And it wasn't efficiently managed with open access, hence tragedy of the commons. But in particular, the design was for grazing animals, a particular technology. When people began to want to farm that commons because there wasn't enough food to go around, that's where the diggers and the levelers came from, and it profoundly changed the society. So I think there is a kind of, you know, the latter-day artificial scarcity created by labor unions to counter the power of monopoly capital had this natural predecessor. Mm-hmm. So I think whether these scarcities are produced or unproduced probably matters a bit.
Oh, yeah.
But the question I wanted to put to you was, you said that information is scarce. For many of us, exactly the opposite would seem to be the case. And I know you said our ability to make use of it. Mm-hmm. It may be, therefore, that the scarcity is one of attention, or something like attention. And we know in these networked economies, the monopoly, far from being an abuse of power, is a natural consequence of the operation of those economies. They tip into concentration, mm-hmm. and their inefficiencies may be that they innovate too slowly or too rapidly compared to a benchmark we can't measure. So it was just
a very good points. Particularly the historical one, which is to say, let's look at what's happened in the past, kind of on a smaller level. I mean, the story I was telling was, 45,000 feet or something. The issue about information is a very good one, too, because what you have to have is a lot of information, a lot of it, and you gotta know what to do with it. What that suggests is if that's the key to success, that this is a natural, I'm not sure you want to say it, but it's a natural economies of scale and a natural monopoly. And the question is, are you going to get rid of it or not? Because I don't think you can. Naturally, having a large database, I mean, this is an advantage that I think eventually China will have. Because they will have so much more information than the US or Britain or anybody, EU or anybody else. And they will be able to have advantages in that. And that comes from scale. That means, oh, we're going to break up Google. It's not going to help, okay? Because the natural market will want to get back together, and somebody will come back. We've seen this in telecoms, right? We broke up the AT&T into like a bazillion pieces, and they're all back together again now. You can't fight that. You have to come up with a way of dealing with it. Do I know that? No, I don't. But I do know that, yes, the size of the database you have and that you can work with is going to be very critical. And that'll say scale is important. So I agree with you. We seem to agree on everything. What are we doing wrong here, Jonathan?
Another question? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned about the three countries. The capital is a growing phase is from 1870 to 1915, so that means 45 years is a growth figure. And now we are in a cyber crisis halfway. So how long do you think that this growth period is from when and until when? So there's a rapid growth period.
Okay, so your question, I'm
That question is
not sure I heard everything, but
yeah.
you want to find out how fast is this going to happen? Okay. There's a couple of levels to that question. What happened in some sense is that U.S. industry in particular, okay, closely followed by Japanese and European, went through a period of very rapid industrialization, very rapid, okay? So if you look at 1915 and you say, what were the big companies, okay? Well, maybe a little longer, maybe 1930. Those big companies stayed the same for a long time, and they used to be our big companies, okay? So it wasn't like it all happened at once. Meanwhile, you see at the less developed countries, very little going on, okay? We do see, in particularly East Asia, that there was a rapid follow-on. Okay, once we get past the Second World War and we get into the 1960s and 1970s, then we begin to see manufacturing spread. Part of the individual there is because capital became less scarce. Okay, so in a sense, that really was over 100 years. Okay, how long it really took to develop that. There was an intense period of development for that 40, 45 years that I mentioned. I will think it will be less. Incidentally, this is a conjecture, okay? It will be less, and what that means is change will be much faster. And that will be much more difficult politically. Let me give you an example. When we mechanized farming, the number of farmers went down slowly. And it was okay because new jobs were opening up. As manufacturing is going down, it's going down much faster. Is the economy ready to absorb that? I don't think we know, okay? But it is going down quickly. And AI might say, well, that's fine, we don't need as many. But just as a social issue, one of the big companies in the United States, worldwide, was called Kodak. Kodak made cameras, they made these gigantic machines for processing film. There was maybe another 20,000 people that worked for drugstores that ran these machines, right? I think at their peak they had about 135,000 people who worked for that, okay? What do we have now? I'll take a picture. Okay. Is there anything similar to this now, where there's some public thing where information, yeah, it's Instagram. Instagram has maybe about 100 people. So we've had a reduction in the employment devoted to images, visual images, from 135,000 to about 100. Fast. Can the economy absorb that? I mean, in the past, it's been slow enough that we've been able to absorb things. Now, it's not easy. I mean, if you lose your job because, your farm doesn't pay anymore, you still have costs of making the transition. But if it happens fast, then, see, that's really my concern. I don't think it's going to take another 45 years. I think it's going to be 15. And maybe that's optimistic. Okay, but if that's the question, that's at least my conjecture. Okay.
Two things, Jerry. One motivated by your last comment. The speed of change, because you also have something else compounding it. That's that the technology, new technology is being developed very fast also. So you have tried to change the social system because of technology while the ground under you is being accelerated away from you. Mm-hmm. And that's going to really complicate things. Let me throw one more observation out. And this sort of goes to what I hope Lisa talks about in her talk, so you should all stay here. And that's, my experience is that the people who control, especially our legislators, our ministers, etc., don't understand at all the technology that's underpinning this new society, because they just haven't, it's not been part of their education. It's only fairly recently that a Lamont school even talked about that. And that's also a major problem we have now. As you know, the hill in the US, and I suspect that's true in the diet, is probably relatively empty of that. And just one other comment, if you look at a place like Singapore, where the governing people, many have computer science degrees, and the speed at which they could change. So everything gets meshed together, and it's going to be an exciting time.
Dave and I were in Washington, D.C., these many years ago, and we worked at the FCC, and we were dealing with a difficult merger, which had a lot of technology involved. We were working with the Federal Trade Commission. At the time, the Federal Trade Commission had no techies and a few economists. And they were going to the economists to answer technical questions. So we had some technologists like Dave, and the Federal Trade Commission loved to talk to Dave, and who was up there? Hatfield? Yeah. But we had two people who became the government's economic experts on this merger. Okay, technical experts. And it was nutty, okay? Then I knew one other economist over at the Justice Department, but that was it. When we got together for lunch, there weren't too many of us, I'll tell you that. So it was all lawyers. In fact, I used to kid when I first arrived that this was Captain Jerry having crash landed on Planet Law. Okay, that's kind of how I felt. So, but yes, those expertise is not there. Somebody else here?
You say that antitrust law is not going to work at this cyber civilization meeting.
Yeah.
Do you have any hints for what should replace the antitrust law? Because all I see now is the government is trying to control the personal information such as GDPR. But as Jonathan said, it's not really working for consumers because it's not really useful. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions.
I wish I did. I mean, right now, it's like, well, what are the problems we have? And that's what I try to identify. It seems a big one is privacy. Okay? A bigger problem is getting people interested in privacy. That's a big one. And that's, when you were saying, well, what do you think about monopoly pricing for U.S. Steel? Well, everybody had an opinion about that. But it's like, Google wants my, make that sure. So, in some sense, there's I think it's a big problem. But what you need to do, if you're gonna have political action on it, is you need to convince everybody it's a big problem. That's what I think the big problem is. Now, if the next question that I raised is, here we have these new giant corporations that are gonna unduly affect the political process. Well, that's been going on for 200 years, and we haven't solved that problem yet. But we had that problem when we had big manufacturing firms and big oil firms and what have you. That was still there. It still is. Okay, now we have a bunch of new firms. We haven't solved it so far. I don't know how to solve it. Okay? Is that, I mean, I'd like to be able to give you an answer, but, you know, I think the best thing is to say, well, what is the problem? And I'm not satisfied we have a problem we can really nail that's going to get people, and they oh, it's too big. Well, what does that mean? Are they hurting you? Well, it's too big, but I use Amazon Prime. Okay? Yeah, I use Google all the time. So, you know, we have to have a problem that's a real economic problem, and I think will attract support from people, other than being too big. I think that's kind of silly. My take. Okay.
Now it's on. Thank you. Thank you very much. Andrew Adams from Meiji University. It's good that actually that question came in before mine, because I wanted to give a specific example and get your feelings on this. If we look back at what you said, the second wave solution was, which was to empower labour against the capital domination. The issue about specifically privacy, and there are other issues which you raised, and I agree with you that this is a very complex set of circumstances, but the one issue of the preponderance of information about people, because there's other types of information as well that are coming into this, but the information about people. Now, as a philosophically pro-privacy person, I dislike this view, but from an economic perspective, it's been suggested by some that if we turn information about people into something which has a property right that subsists in the same way we basically looked at labour having a right beyond when you do it, that you have a right to share in the proceeds of the product of your labour. That instead of saying that we restrict what can be done with the personal data, and except in cases where it does clear harm, that we say you have a right to share in the proceeds of what's done with your data, because what happens at the moment is you get some free services from the first company that you interact with to give that data to, and then that data stops being of any benefit to you directly when it's passed around. So if we were to go for a property right in personal data and say every time that's used, the company that uses it, when they pay for it, when they get some benefit out of it, that has to flow back to the individual. Is that a concept you think could work in this specific part of this problem?
That's interesting. Well, there's sort of two ways to approach this. One is you've taken a fairly aggressive approach, saying we have a law that says if you sell off people's information, you are required to give back a certain percentage. Okay? That's a mandated, essentially, economic transaction. You say you have to do this transaction this way. Another way to approach it, which would certainly be, I would like, but I don't think it will work well, is to force Google to say, I would like to use your private information, okay? And Google might indeed say, and I'm not going to pay you for it. But if you want to use Google, then you say yes. So in essence, it becomes a trade. You get free search service, and I get free use of your data. Do you agree with that? And my guess is 90% of people would say yes. I don't think they should, but that's probably what's going to happen. If you could say, no, you got to pay me 20 cents for every time it's used, there are the transactions between Google and the customer. What you're suggesting is something a little deeper, okay? That is to say, when Google now takes the next step in the vertical chain and sells that to somebody else, then the originator of that information should get a cut of that. Well, if you think about this, and let's say, consider a manufacturing situation where you manufacture, I don't know, chaise lounges, okay? And I buy them from you and sell them retail, okay? And I pay you a price. Then I sell them to customers who use them on their decks and whatnot, and I pay them a price. Do we ever see a situation in which what happens is I have to pay you a percentage of what I sell it to the end customer? And no, I've never seen that kind of transaction. Now, I don't think it would work very well, but I think that's pretty much the, yeah.
Shall I get back on very briefly? Copyright is the model that a couple of people have suggested. We do have exactly that model in copyright.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly the model by which we've run copyright for over 100 years. That when you sell it on, money goes back. When you reuse somebody's copyright, if you want to use somebody's music in a film, the fact that you bought a copy from the person who sold you a copy doesn't give you the right to put it in your film. You've then got to go back to the recording artist and the composer and the recorder and make that payment. So there is a model there in information that we can use.
Could work. We'll see what it does to the market. I mean, if it starts making Google be much less accommodating to search, in fact, they might start charging for search. And then they said, why are you charging for search? It was always free. I said, well, we have this new rule. You know, that would be the end of that rule pretty quick. But yeah, I think the idea could be there, and it could be tried, and we'll see how it works. So, but again, I think we all have to adapt to this new world. And not going to be any simple solutions as far as I can say. Well, that's a good one to try out. Use the copyright thing. Okay.
With the exception that you monetize your personality, not your output that you put out there. It's not work that you published, it's your individual traits. Jonathan, please?
I'd like to come back quickly on that, because there are other sorts of, thank you, other sorts of examples of, it is on.
No,
Can you push it?
I can hear you, so.
The translator.
Translator can't. Oh, its green light was on, so I assume that.
Green.
Okay, good.
Okay, that's fine. So if you collect data about me, for example, medical data and things like that, or even data about my consumption habits, it has different kinds of values. One value is it allows you to triangulate and target me. That's ambiguous as to whether I should be paid, because I could be offered something which is uniquely of value. But the fact that it's you, the merchant, offering it to me, limits my ability, limits my mobility, and ability to force other people to compete to meet my needs better. So in that case, it is not the existence of the property right, but its governance that's important. On the other hand, if it's medical information, it has a secondary value, which is to convey information about people like me. And this is where the privacy thing becomes imperfect. Because if we tie it, as we have done, to the identification of a single individual, then the fact that I can narrow you down to 3 or 5 individuals with stratified medicine, that creates a certain value. You get some of that value because you get treatment that works for you. And it wouldn't necessarily if you were the only data point in that. But if we don't resolve that ambiguity of values, something much worse happens. People conceal and don't share their information, but not in a uniform way. The people who opt out and go dark may have characteristics that are correlated with those that we use when we analyze the data. And that selection bias means that the failure to resolve that initial rights question has meant that the mechanism that should have produced an answer is producing a wrong answer. Another simple example of that would be algorithmic collusion, which is a problem. It is an antitrust problem, and it requires some form of solution. We can't do it by nailing the company that takes money for its services, because that's not where the harm came from, and that's not where the benefit is accrued. So I agree, there's some big open questions. I think they're even bigger and more open.
What we've seen is you say privacy, or I say privacy, is that, oh, well, that's a simple question. What we've just demonstrated is it's not. There's all kinds of possible ways we can solve that, or think of solving it, but it's going to be tough, and it's going to give CRCC a reason for doing some research. So I see we're pretty close to One of the problems here, as the last speaker in the morning, is that we're up against lunch. Okay, and I'm afraid I'll lose all the audience unless I stop.
Okay, thank you very much for a fascinating